Hi everybody, I'm Steve. I'm here to talk to you about the road to Rails 4.1 and a couple other things as well. So yeah, as it was mentioned, I'm now currently unemployed. I love Jumpstart and Jeff is awesome, but there's one little tiny problem, and that is that I am super burned out in general. So I think this is something we don't talk about enough as a community in general. Chad was really awesome talking about how, homeostasis is when your body is able to persist itself. And so the issue when people get burned out and when people that we, work with and care about get burned out is that basically what you're doing is not sustainable. So we've had a number of people sort of burn out and leave Ruby various times over the years. I'm not planning on leaving Ruby, even though I'm standing here in a Rust t-shirt, which was not on the slides. You can't write Rust at 6 Wonderkinder. The language isn't even done yet. Come on. Anyway. So the point is basically that I am a little negative today, so I apologize. I might be a little tinged that way, so it happens. So I want to talk to you about Rails 4.1. Yeah. So there's this really funny thing that happens with conference talks, and I stress out conference organizers. I'm sure Raphael is always pinging me hey, Steve, you said you sent me that thing. You didn't send me that thing yet. Hey, can you tell me what you're going to talk about at my conference? So there's this weird situation where when you apply to give a talk, you say what your talk is going to be, and then it gets accepted, and then months go by, and then you actually give your talk, right? So things can change between that time period. So I am lucky enough to have spoken at a lot of conferences, and so people trust that I will do a reasonable job of speaking at a conference. And so what I usually say is, I will tell you what I'll talk about closer to your conference date. And then usually I arrive at said conference and the organizer pulls me aside and is like, hey, you didn't tell me what you were actually going to talk about. Can you tell me this finally? So I pitched this talk, The Road to Rails 4.1. And what's sort of unfortunate about the fact that I decided to pick The Road to Rails 4.1 is that I hoped we'd be a lot further along in the process of getting Rails 4.1 out by this point in time, but we're not. And this is partially my fault, having commit to Rails. So this is refocused slightly. So what I want to talk to you about is why we are not farther along with the release of Rails 0.1 and how the Rails release process works and how we do work on Rails. So it's sort of a little teeny pivot, let's say, away from instead of, hey, we implemented all these great features, here are the pull request numbers, it's here's all the features we're going to implement someday in the future. So there's a little bit of refocusing there. And the reason I wanted to give this talk and why I don't mind this refocusing is that I have this feeling that most people don't actually care anything about how Rails is made itself. Again, this may be me being a little overly negative, but I didn't used to care about this either. So basically everything that I say in this talk, I am super, super guilty of. So I am not here to tell you that I'm amazing and you are bad. I built an entire startup on Rails and worked with Rails in a freelance manner and use Rails for a ton of time before I even bothered to think about how Rails is made and what the process is by which Rails gets developed. But this is something that affects all of us, right? This is Rails Israel, we all use Rails. So if you don't know how Rails gets released, but it is your largest dependency, that is something that is kind of scary to me. And thinking about this sustainability and permanence idea, I think it's kind of ridiculous that Aaron Patterson is the only person that is paid to work on Rails when it literally gives us all our entire livelihoods. So this is a talk to inform you a little bit about what I've learned from working on Rails, because that's how I learn things, is I just sort of jump in. So I was like, I don't know how Rails works. I'm going to start contributing to Rails, and the things that I've learned along the way. So now I care about Rails, and I would love it if all of you cared about Rails. So here's why that matters to a certain extent. So like I said before, Rails provides us with all of our livelihoods. And one of the interesting things that's come up lately is the topic of Ruby gems and security relating to Ruby gems. So I tweeted something about this a couple days ago. There's a gem called "This will RMRF your hard drive" with underscores. And the subtitle is "Rubyists will install any gem you want whatsoever." And if you load up that gem, it actually just puts "seriously?" ? But there was a conference in which I can sound super smug because I did not fall for the trap, but that's just because I didn't notice it was happening. But at Ruby Nation this year in Washington, D.C., somebody actually printed up cards that said, gem install Ruby Nation, and then wrote a Ruby Nation gem and released it. And if I remember correctly, what the gem did was basically print like, yo, I could have done some real bad stuff to your computer. Why did you just install this random gem you saw written on a card that was like laying around in a conference? And so he counted the download numbers and estimated that 25% of the people who attended the conference installed the gem. So that's like 25%. You know, it's like, look to your left, look to your right. Oh, that's thirds, not quarters, but whatever. We talked about math and fractions and stuff earlier. So the point is that we don't think a lot about the code we depend on every day, and we depend on a massive amount of other people's code. Like, and one of the beautiful things about open source is that I no longer have to write the entire universe myself to get going, right? This is what's great, is relying on other people's code. And this is what motivates me to work on open source, because I would like to write code so that you guys don't have to write code. Earlier today, I did I installed the latest version of Rails, or the development, whatever head is, and I did a bundle install into a vendor directory, and then I ran CLOC, which is count lines of code, on that directory, and this is a report. If you haven't used CLOC, it's a really interesting, cool tool, but it basically gives you a breakdown of all of the amount of code you have per language, and then the files, blank lines, comments, and then actual code. So it can actually know what the comments are in each language and tell you the lines of real, actual code. So if you do a Rails new and then bundle and then CD into it and count the lines of code, so this is like no application code whatsoever, just the bare minimum defaults. And not even the stuff that the scaffold generates for you that are the defaults, right? Because it puts code in there too. I'm just talking about the gem sources themselves. You are bringing in 312,839 lines of Ruby, HTML, JavaScript, CSS, Java, C, YAML, makefiles, C++ headers, and Yak and PHP. I don't know. I think some of those might be false positives, maybe, but I would hope so. The point is that like so we just saw this presentation by Constantine, right, about all these terrible, terrible things that can happen in 6 lines of code, and this is now 300,000, right? So in my darkest hours, I imagine that all 300,000 of those lines are almost Sinatra repeated, 600,000 times or whatever, or I guess it'd be 150,000 times. So this is just from a blank Rails application, but I thought, what about a regular actual production Rails application, right? Because this is the default gems that come with Rails. This isn't like a normal Rails app that you would use, because the first thing that we do when we build a Rails application is add like 30 gems to our gem file, right? And everybody has their gems that they prefer to use. I maintain and use and love Ruby gems. So I decided to download Discourse and do Discourse's bundle install, and that took forever because there are a lot of gems. And so in this production Rails application, there are 1 million lines down here on this bottom left-hand side, 1 million lines of code that was not actually written by Discourse themselves. Okay, so this is like super, super massive. There's so much stuff in there, and there's so much stuff that could possibly go wrong, right? If you read through the Rails bug tracker, which is something that I do and is part of why I'm burned out, is there are like all of these bugs that are like, I'm using STI with associations, and I have nested attributes. And when I'm trying to make an odd number of 3-level nested STI nested attributes forms, there's a bug where it doesn't give me the data. Help. And I just cry. This is hard, and software is really, really, really hard. And there's a lot of code. Anyway, apparently something really funny is going on behind the screen. I don't understand. That's not part of what I'm talking about. So yeah, basically just this, right? Like all of this stuff, super, super like frowny. It keeps me up at night. It makes me worried. I don't know what's going on. I stress out over this kind of thing, mostly because you all don't stress out about this kind of thing. I think actually if we all stressed out about it together, I would be less stressed out because we would be dealing with these engineering issues that we have. Okay, now I would like to explain to you how the Rails development process works, because this is something that was completely opaque to me when I started, and I get lots of questions about this. So basically, we pick some features that will go in the next version of Rails. Like, these are some things that I've been having problems with building applications lately. We being basically the Rails team. And then various people write some code to implement whatever those features are. Usually the people that suggested those features write those features up. Then other people that are not part of the Rails team occasionally submit pull requests. Some of those pull requests get merged, sometimes they don't. And then we do a release at some point in time whenever enough of those features are done. So this is kind of simultaneously really simple and really straightforward and really terrifying, right? Because there is no, I assumed before I actually dug into how the Rails release process worked and how we manage Rails, I assumed that it worked like this. We would pick a release date, we would choose a list of features ranked on priority as to what mattered the most in the next upcoming release cycle. If we were running a little bit late, we would decide to cut features based on that priority, and then we would put out a release on some kind of schedule. And this is just absolutely terribly not how it worked, and this was sort of my mental model of what I assumed that a project as large as Rails would actually do. Now, I don't necessarily think this is a bad thing. Again, I'm being a little negative today, but what's really great about this particular approach, not this approach, but this approach, is that it means that there's a lot of interesting stuff that goes on, and there's a lot of fresh and interesting ideas. This is a little interesting and a little weird. This is really super boring and straightforward. So I started using Ruby because it was a little interesting and a little weird. I don't know about all of you and when you started Ruby or why you started using Ruby, but that was what was always most attractive to me, is that Ruby and Rubyists were not afraid to be a little interesting and a little weird. And sometimes things are a bit broken, but we just kind of smile and go, yeah, okay, whatever, it happens. And I think that's an incredible asset to us and how we build things. So I'm not saying that Rails should work like this. I'm just saying that I thought Rails worked like this, and it does not. So as far as releasing stuff goes, again, it may sound like I'm a little down on the Rails release process, but the sort of the unwritten rule of the Ruby world in general, and I suspect the world outside of Ruby, is that nobody else really does this process particularly well either. So it's not as if I can say all of the gems you depend on, they totally go through this great engineering process by which they get released into the world. I maintain tons of gems too, and I basically just pick some random features and then work on them for a while, and I'm like, wow, I haven't released this gem in a minute. I better go do that, on a Saturday or something when I'm bored. So I'm not saying that I am better than this, or that other language ecosystems, to my understanding, some of them do this better, but most of them, at least in the open source world, work like this as well. So I have a story, a very, very depressing, sad story for you about Rescue. I really love Rescue. I like working on it. I think it's an important project. A lot of people use Rescue. The only time that I don't like Rescue is when Sidekick users make fun of me for liking Rescue. But I hadn't put out Rescue in a while because I had been traveling a lot this summer. And so there's a bunch of patches that had gotten merged, and I've been reviewing things for a while, and it had been a little bit for a release. And so a friend of mine said, hey, Steve, I really need this patch that's only on Master of Rescue. If I do the work of putting a release together, will you release it? So there is a lot of stuff that goes into releasing a project that's as big as Rescue is. I try to maintain a decent change log with a list of the changes and links to commits and be responsible, at least in that last moment before I release stuff, right? It's not as if the process is responsible, but at least the end result is responsible. So I said, sure. That would be great, because the only reason I haven't released yet is because I've not had the couple hours to put the change log together and all those kinds of things. So he did, and I released it as Rescue 1.25.0.pre, and said, hey, world, I'm going to release this new version of Rescue. Thank you for putting this release together, so-and-so. And please let me know if you have any problems. And then I went and got on some planes and went to some Ruby conferences and worked on Rails and checked emails and did all these other things. And about a month later, I was like, okay, I haven't heard anything positive or negative from anyone about this Rescue release. So I guess since he needed it that badly, it must be working, and he works at somewhere that uses rescue pretty heavily, so if there was a problem, I probably would have heard about it by now. So cool, I'm just gonna change the pre to the final release and then actually release it. The problem was there was an error in the actual code which I had messed up I had messed up a situation with the forwardable library and the standard library. So you use standard library things because they're there, right? They're dependable, they're always around. So I had done a refactoring, I'd used forwardable, my tests were all passing, I felt really good about it, everything was going. I used Travis to test rescue, and everything was good. So sure, sounds good, I'll release it. Turns out that my test harness was requiring forwardable from the standard library. So when I ran the tests, I got all greens, but that version of rescue just like plain did not work. If you tried to start a worker, it would just fail. And so then I got bug reports of like, hey, I upgraded to rescue and it doesn't work anymore. And I went, that's really weird. You must have a borked Ruby installation because forwardable is available everywhere. And there's no way that you can't require forwardable. It doesn't work. Like, what's going on? Can't find module forwardable. And then I realized, like, oh no, what did I actually do? And so I asked said friend, like, hey, man, how's that new rescue thing been going? He's like, oh, I got busy. I didn't get a chance to do that yet. And so this is not to say that that person, who I'm specifically not naming, is bad, because this is entirely, completely my responsibility. And one of the features of rescue is that it is super stable, and I try to maintain Semver very strictly, and I know that Living Social, for example, is a heavy user of rescue and pours all of their credit card transactions through rescue. Releasing rescue stresses me out because I imagine a world in which jobs fail and then credit card transactions don't get processed and then my friends are on the street. Which may be a little too worst case scenario, but that's what I think makes for good programmers, is imagining all the terrible things that can go wrong and then trying to fix them before they actually happen. But I did not do the proper engineering to the point where I didn't even boot up the release enough to know that I released code that was just straight up broken. And Rescue has 30,000 users. So I fear that we as a culture do not have a good release process and engineering practices baked in, which has historically been a strength, but I wonder if it's not slowly turning into a weakness. And that's my fault. So more Rails development process, not arcana exactly, but things that I did not know that I get questions about all the time. So people say, hey Steve, why did you not merge my pull request? So here's how pull requests work with Rails. Pull request gets submitted. Somebody that has commit access gets bored and decides to read the issue tracker. They may give some feedback, which may lead to some more commits. And then step 4, could I justify this to everyone else on the team? And then merge me, maybe. So I, until recently, read every single open issue and pull request and bug on the Rails issue tracker. I get emails, I read them 3 times a day. So everything that has ever been on the Rails bug tracker I have read, but there are 100 open pull requests or some massive number of pull requests. So people say, why didn't you merge this change? And the big step is number 4. Can I justify this to everyone else? Now I think that this is a good rule ultimately, because it means that I don't just merge dumb stuff into Rails. Because I want to encourage people to contribute, so maybe this patch is not that great, but it's a first-time contributor and they did their best, and I don't want to bog them down with bureaucracy, so maybe I would merge it. But that might mean Rails would get worse. So there's sort of this social pressure that, if, for example, I know basically nothing about Active Record. I don't work on Active Record at all. I don't look at the code or read that part. I specialize in other parts of the Rails code base. So if there's a Active Record code change, I should not merge it because I'm not qualified to merge it, being one of the more junior members on the team. So I think this is a good rule. But the real question is justifying this to who? So David wrote this thing called the Parlay letter, which is a really good blog post. Ruby Rogues Parlay had this mailing list called, well, the Ruby Rogues had a list called the Ruby Parlay, and David joined it and said a bunch of things, and people argued back and forth, and eventually I think Gary Bernhardt and him got angry, and so they both quit. And so he wrote up what he said in there as a blog post, and this is something that has a large impact on everyone that uses Rails in terms of justifying things, right? Because David is the benevolent dictator of Rails, so he has the final say. So ultimately, I have to justify him not reverting a patch that I merge. So I know this might be controversial to some, but I have no problem saying Basecamp is the single most important application for Rails. I evaluate every design technique or feature in Rails first against what it would do for Basecamp. It's by no means the only evaluation, but it is the first. And he goes on to say that like GitHub is Basecamp and Groupon is Basecamp and Living Social is Basecamp. Like he means broadly Basecamp, not just Basecamp itself. But it does mean that anything that's obviously a good idea for applications like Basecamp gets on a fast track for inclusion. Anything that's not obviously a good idea has to travel through a longer, more rigorous proving path to find its way in. So this is sort of like another reason that patches don't get merged. It's like, is this useful for a more traditional server-side application? Yes or no? And so this is also a blocker, right? So if you want a feature in Rails because you're building your application, if your application is not like Basecamp, you may sort of be on your own to a certain degree. And I think that now, after the Rails 3 situation, we have a much better plugin architecture, so you're able to change Rails in ways that it was not intended for just Basecamp. But as far as like merging stuff goes, this is like a big blocker towards getting certain things in, because I sort of have to imagine if I'm going to get in trouble or not for clicking merge. And if I don't know, the answer is not to do anything. So that happens. Okay, so that's sort of like stuff around the release process of Rails. And it's actually, it's a lot of effort to even release Rails. There's a document in the Rails root about the process that we go through. It's a big, giant process to check everything to make sure that you don't release. One of the steps is run Rails new and generate a new application, and then run Rails server to boot it up so that you don't release a Rails that's totally broken, like what I did with Rescue. So there's actually a lot of engineering and effort that goes into releasing Rails itself and building the gem. So now that we've talked about sort of this process and why this happens, I want to talk about what will actually be in Rails 4.1. So that whole feature selection process is one of the things that we kind of do. So I also want to disclaim that none of this is a promise whatsoever. If you've ever seen Aaron give a keynote that's like this, he basically says like, here's what we're thinking about, but it all could change. So this is the stuff that I'm pretty sure we are going to do, but please do not take this as a promise of any kind. I'm just sort of letting you know things that we have talked about in various places. So one of the big things that's coming for Rails is that we had a really fantastic Google Summer of Code this year. So we had 5 separate things that were Summer of Code projects, and so I'm guessing that they all probably will get in because that work is being wrapped up. So some of those examples are a Rails web console. So if you get an error page, you could actually have a REPL in the web page that would be able to talk to your Rails server and interrogate what happened and like debug it in the moment. So that's kind of super cool. Reworking initialization, right? Because people are feeling a lot of pain around Rails startup times, and a lot of work has gone into profiling that, but if we rework how that works, we might be able to get some gains. So that was a project that was happening. Faster and better HTML sanitization. So when I first saw this, I was like, what? Why do I care about that? And then I realized that, since Rails 3, every string in your application that gets spit into a template is HTML sanitized first. So this is like all of the stuff that actually gets put out to your browser goes through a process of sanitization. So a speed increase in that should be a significant, large speed increase. And if you look at the Rails code base today, the HTML sanitization code was like written by James Buck like 6 years ago and has not been touched since because we were terrified of security issues happening if we don't sanitize things wrong. So we're integrating the Loofah gem, which is fantastic and fast and modern and everything is cool. So I'm super excited about that. We're talking about collection updates and deletions and modifications for RESTful resources. And then one other thing I'm really excited about is Action View being extracted out of Action Pack. So all of the like sort of sub gems in Action Pack sort of, I mean they're not individual gems, right? But Action Pack consists of Action Dispatch and Action View and stuff like that. It was all very tightly coupled. So a couple people put in a Herculean amount of effort so that you actually could totally re-implement your own Action View if you wanted to. Or you can remove it entirely if you're, say, serving up a JavaScript-heavy application where you don't need to use the Rails view layer, or if you're just serving up an API and you don't want to use the Rails view layer, that will allow you to eliminate some of those 300,000 lines of code that you didn't write that may cause bugs in your program. So all these things are things that are very close to being done because the summer has been over. Some of the students are wrapping up some of their stuff. So these are things I'm confident. And 4 other things that we're like thinking about and talking about doing, and this is stuff we've all said publicly in other places. The job queue is something that was supposed to go in Rails 4.0, but was not a fully baked idea, and so we decided to punt on it. And so hopefully that will be in 4.1. I'm doing everything I can with Rescue to make that stuff work really well together. So we're talking about what that means. Secret token storage. So if you have a config initializer, secret token.rb, that basically holds the key for all of your session encryption stuff. And it's not in the git ignore by default. So you can accidentally commit it into your repository, and then if you say open source your Rails application, everyone can decode your sessions, and that's bad. And it's one of those things that's really super simple, and there's not as many open source Rails applications as closed source ones, so I think this is the best solution that we currently have right at this particular moment. But for example, when I wrote the Hackety Hack website, I totally had my secret token sitting on GitHub publicly for like 2 years without noticing or something. So this is something that is not ideal. I think it's currently as good as we can make it due to various concerns I won't get into here, but we would like to make it so that it's foolproof in all cases if at all possible. And this is something people have been clamoring for, so we want to try to work on a good solution for that. Spring by John Lighton is sort of this test console runner thing. So you can sort of imagine it as like tests are slow because Rails boot time is slow. Therefore, boot Rails once, run your tests against that running Rails a bunch of times. So there's some talk about using that to speed up tests. And also less volatility. So the idea is that Rails 4.1 should be a drop-in replacement for Rails 4. That upgrade terrifiedness that happens sometimes in upgrading Rails is not perfect, but we're trying to make it as not a problem as possible. So some of the things that we said we were going to deprecate in 4.0 and remove in 4.1, we're not going to remove any of that stuff in 4.1. It's just going to remain deprecated because we like you guys, and we don't want you to have to deal with upgrading things if they're broken. So we're trying to be a little more stable. So these are kind of these lists of features. And one of the things that happened with the Rails 4.0 release cycle is that it took so long that a lot of people took some time off. So I took a lot of time off working on Rails because I had sort of burned the candle at both ends to get 4.0 out the door. And so that's why we're not quite as far along with 4.1 as I wanted us to be. But it should overall be a much smaller release cycle than 4.0 was. So with all that said, less than 3, thank you for listening to my slightly depressing analysis. I think that ultimately the future of Rails is bright, and I tell you all these things because I want you to get involved so that we can help make Rails better for everyone together. So thank you very much.